Welcome back. Before there were selfies at scenic overlooks, there were photos with the root beer lady. Dorothy Moulter was an icon in the Boundary Waters, serving homemade root beer to paddlers who came by. Now her story is heading back to the stage. Sammy Salina has more.
Seasons in the Boundary Waters come and go. And it has been 40 years since Dorothy Moulter greeted canoers from her remote home on Knife Lake, where she lived by herself for 50 years.
I wouldn't know how to live in the city.
She was the last non-Indigenous person to live in the Boundary Waters. She sold homemade root beer to visitors and earned the name the Root Beer Lady.
Her root beer was so popular that they had to limit it, right?
Yes.
And still,
She couldn't keep up.
her legacy lives.
And when I land here in the cabin, I land as Dorothy.
Kim Schultz is the playwright and solo performer of the Root Beer Lady, now coming back to the History Theater for a third time.
We recreated all the signs she had. It's actually Quit Your Belly Aching. I get to imagine what was it like by herself up there. How did she feel about the 1952 Saturday Evening Post headline that called her the loneliest woman in America? Did she agree? Was she mad? Like what? So I get to play.
Schultz consulted with the Dorothy Moulter Museum in Ely.
She was in nursing school at the time she came up to the Boundary Waters canoe area.
Jess Edberg is the executive director.
And she maintained those nursing credentials for a lot of her life. And the fact that she could provide wilderness emergency medical services 15 miles from the nearest road is one of the reasons that she was able to negotiate that lifetime tenancy after the Wilderness Act in '64.
Was the root beer good?
So it depends on who you ask. A lot of folks were in the Boundary Waters for a week or 10 days. And this was the first beverage that they've had that wasn't water from the lake.
The longer you stay in the Boundary Waters, the better the root beer tastes.
After a 10-hour canoe ride in the heat of the summer, I'm sure it tasted pretty amazing.
It was my very first trip to the Boundary Waters.
Jim Grenke visited her on a canoe trip in 1986, the year she died.
I asked her, how does one make root beer out here? And I was expecting this kind of earthy story where you have to dig the roots and you go through a backwoods process. And she said, well, you go into town and you get the ingredients. That popped my bubble a little bit.
He says Kim's portrayal captured who Dorothy really was.
Especially with how at risk the Boundary Waters are. Having this story be told, I think, helps remind us of the importance of wilderness.
And as seasons come and go in the Boundary Waters, Dorothy Moulter's impact is still very much felt.
She was so much more than the root beer lady.
Oh, I bet it tasted so good. If you've ever been up there, you know what I'm talking about. Everything tastes good up there after that much work. The Root Beer Lady runs from July 8th to the 26th. It's at the History Theater in St. Paul. And all this week, we're celebrating America's 250th birthday with a special look at Minnesota's history. This afternoon, we're taking a look at how Minnesota's story is really built on waves of migration. From Native nations and European settlers to refugees and immigrants from around the world, each generation helped shape the place that we know today.
It is known today as the Star of the North, a hub of tech, culture, and Fortune 500 giants. But the story of the land we call Minnesota is an ever-shifting story of migration.
It's always true that there are new groups coming into Minnesota, and it's always true that somebody is a little freaked out by that. That was true in the 1860s and 1870s, it was true in the 1920s, and in some cases it's true today as well.
Going back 250 years, Minnesota, as it would become, was home to many indigenous populations. The Dakota in the south and west, the Ojibwe in the north, with smaller numbers of Ho-Chunk, Iowa, Cheyenne, and others moving through the territory.
A lot of times people look at the history of the United States of America and they start maybe with the first French fur trader, British occupation or American conquest. But there were tens of thousands of years of history here. Before that, that's indigenous history.
European settlement started first with explorers, then fur traders from France and England. After the U.S. Revolution, a series of treaties would open up the Minnesota Territory to white, Yankee, and European settlement. According to the Minnesota Historical Society, from 1850 to 1860, the population grew from 6,000 to 170,000.
As late as 1855, Native Americans constituted the majority of Minnesotans. But that changed in the mid-1850s as large waves of immigrants and migrants, mostly from places like Germany and Scandinavia, began to move and take up farmlands in Minnesota.
Logging and mining booms and free federal land from the Homestead Act turned Minnesota into a European melting pot. Chinese immigrants traded racism from the West Coast for the cold of the upper Midwest. Liang Mei-sin, who escaped a brothel in San Francisco, is documented as the first Chinese-born woman to reside in Minnesota. By 1890, an astonishing 40% of the state's population was foreign-born. The national average, 11%.
And you could find foreign language newspapers in German and Swedish and Norwegian and Polish. All of these languages are being spoken in the schools and in homes and in places of business. We were an immigrant community from the beginning of the state.
With new routes established, immigration slowed in the early 20th century. Anti-immigrant nativism arose during World War I, along with the 1917 Immigration Act from Congress requiring literacy tests and a ban on immigrants from much of Asia. But over the next few decades, Mexicans displaced by the Mexican Revolution came to Minnesota, as did African Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South.
By the 1920s, you see neighborhoods like North Minneapolis, you see neighborhoods like Rondo up here, as African Americans begin moving into the cities, but also into small towns as well, places like Moorhead, where they're establishing themselves as small business people. African Americans are really moving in this period.
Over the last several decades, Minnesota's demographic transformed again as a respite for refugees.
For former soldiers, it was a real safety risk. And that's why the soldiers also were the first one to be given political asylum by Americans.
The loss in Vietnam and the fall of Laos catalyzed the mass emigration of Hmong across the world, with Minnesota becoming the largest concentration of Hmong people in the U.S.
The population of Laos in 1975 was only about 300,000. So imagine about half actually immigrated abroad, not all to the US. They went to France, to Australia, Canada, but the majority did come to the US.
In the 1990s, the Twin Cities became home to the largest Somali population outside Somalia. Recent new arrivals from the Latinx community, India, China, and East Africa continue to rewrite the state's cultural script.
If you missed any of the series this week, we got a full Minnesota 250 special, and it is airing tonight at 6:30. So if you got the family around, you want to learn a little bit about what Minnesota looked like in 1776, how the land changed ownership over 150 years, and of course the people that have occupied this land for centuries, you can watch at 6:30, and you can also stream it right now. It's on our app. Stick with us. We got more news and weather coming up after the break.